Alright, Stroff, and I wanted to take a look at some exercises from the step method. Step 2, double attacking with the queen. Alright, so first of all, this is intended for beginner chess players that have a good understanding of the rules and would like to spend some time focusing on tactics, learning some new tactics, learning some different ways to apply them in relatively simple contexts, right? Okay, so with that in mind, let's just get right into it. First of all, I see an unguarded rook, and I also see the king, right, which is in and of itself a very good target for attacking. And then I also see that this back rank is very sensitive to mating, right? We can mate on many of these squares with the queen. So if we combine those ideas, we can see that if we just go right ahead to c4, we can attack a mating square and the rook on b3. Okay, so let's get to the next one. See if we can apply the same concepts to this one. See an unguarded rook again, another king. Well, who would have guessed? And we see another mating square. Okay, so looking at that one, we only notice one possible direction in which we can attack two of these, right? And that's, boom, right ahead to c5. Okay. In the next one, we see this one over here. Let's up the pace a little bit. You get the gist of it. And once you get good at visualizing all the different lines going to and fro different places, you can see queen d6 rather quickly. Okay, let's delete all of that and go to the next row. I see this rook over here, I see the king, and another couple of mating squares. I'm sure by now you start to see a pattern. These unguarded pieces, this one as well, but I can't get to it very easily, are in combination with the mating squares a very good way of creating double attacks. Okay, so queen to f2 reaches two of these, right? Okay, here it's black to move. This one's a little bit more complicated, I can tell you that much. So we see directly that this back rank is in a lot of trouble. See a couple of squares here where it's a little bit conditional whether or not this is going to lead to a mate, depending on what white will do. But for now we have enough targets of attack. We can see queen to c5 and queen to g5 emerging, right, attacking the two different rooks, either the one on f2 or h6. Now the thing is, we want to think about not just double attacks, but also essentially double defenses, right? If you're clever and you can create two problems at once, maybe white can solve two at once. Now in the case of c5, we can think that white can do rook f1. So he moves the rook away from that diagonal under which it's under attack, and he's also guarding all these mating squares, particularly the one on c1 that the queen is targeting right now. Now the thing with queen g5 is obviously this rook on h6 over here can't move to the back rank because it's blocked by the pawn. So now if the rook on f2 wants to guard, it can go right ahead because we'll just capture the other rook. So queen g5 is in fact the proper move. Okay, so let's go to the next one, right? That one was a little bit more tricky. This one's tricky for a different reason. If you're the kind of person that likes to go right at it and just looks at the king and is like, how can I attack that? You might be a little bit stuck for a while until you notice this crucial bishop all the way on g7. That's especially true if you're playing with a real board, where everything's a little bit vaster, right? Especially children tend to miss out on those things on the bigger distances, right? Not all of them, but some of them. It's just a tendency, if you will. But once we see that, we notice that this is a mating square. And we also notice, of course, that this piece is undefended, the knight on g3. Now, it's not very hard to combine those two ideas together. Once you see that, then queen c3 is the obvious double attack here. Okay, let's go to the next one. It's black to move, and we notice the knight is covering these two squares. And that means that we just need the queen over here to complete a mating attack. And we see a bishop here on g5. It's a little bit awkwardly positioned, no defenders at all. So if we move to b5, we can attack both of those at the same time. How tricky. Alright, so in this next one, it's white to move again. We see, this one's interesting. So we see, of course, the bishop and the rook are undefended. We see a whole lot of mating squares because of this weak back rank. And that leads us to either this move or queen g5 to make use of that. Now the question is, which one of these is better, if any, right? And in this case, we can't really defend with the rook. If we move rook to e4, it will simply fall, right? And even then, I can just mate, right? I don't even have to capture the rook if I went to g5. So it doesn't really solve black's problem in either two of the variations. And the bishop can't really be of much help. At least the rook will fall. And yeah, what are you going to do then, right? So in this case, it's about creating an opportunity for the black king to escape and at the same time defending the rook. That can obviously only be done by the pawns, and then you notice the only move that does anything is pawn g5. However, that's when you should instantly also notice the difference between the two moves, right? Namely that queen g5 simply blocks it, because, well, you know, if you move a piece to the square, it's occupying that square, right? Very simple principle. So queen g5 is the right move. Okay, here we see a very clear mating pattern, right? We see queen g2 checkmate. And with that in mind, we can start targeting some pieces here that are undefended. And then we notice, well, this mate square is only accessible from this huge diagonal, reaching all the way from a8 to h1, right? And then we only see one square on that diagonal that safely attacks the rook, that we can also conveniently reach with the queen, which is queen b7, right? So, on to the next one. This one is interesting. If you move the queen next to the king, obviously it needs defense from a piece in order to survive that, otherwise the king will simply capture. And in that case, the only two moves where the king can escape, in the case that you have a defender that is the... Let's say you move the queen to this square. You can only move to the two squares that a knight would be able to go to. Those are the only squares that the queen can't reach. Right? It's a very interesting pattern, which means that if you look at this one over here, you can see that the king can't go anywhere anymore, because these two squares are covered by the pawns that are blocking the escape. So this is a mating square. And then instantly we notice this oddly placed knight, pawn in between the bishop and knight, so that we can double attack on c3. Okay, so here it's black to move again. I notice this bishop eyeing down on h2, which should instantly give you ideas of checkmating over here with the queen, which you could indeed do in the future. And then we notice this really weirdly, awkwardly placed bishop, right? And that tends to happen quite a bit in real games, right? This mating threat is quite realistic, and the fact that things that are placed on this fourth rank that are not defended are sensitive to these double attacks from the queen, where it gives out a check, a nasty little check, for example, like this, when the king is still on e1, or a mating threat like in this position, right? So to simplify it all down, that means that in this case, queen h4 is a double attack. Okay. So in this one we see that the f7 square, which is already quite vulnerable just from being such an awkward square in the starting position of a game of chess, is now also being ogled down by the bishop. And that means that it's a mating square. When the queen gets there, it's mate. And then we see this knight over here, which is unguarded. You might say, well, it's under attack by a pawn, but obviously that pawn is pinned, so it doesn't make for a very good attacker, right? So now we might have this idea of queen to f2. Of course, we do need to check up on that for 1 second and say, what if the knight tries to go back and guard that? But in this case, because this pawn is still on e7, still blocking the bishop on c8, so that the knight would still fall, right? Very simple principle, right? So queen f2 is the proper double attack. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you hopefully in a future video.